thesis, I intend to answer whether the Dutch in the 17th century were regarded by Taiwan's indigenous peoples as some stranger king. The idea of stranger king was initiated by this guy, Sahlins, the anthropologist, the American anthropologist, a big name in the Pacific anthropology studies. It initiated in his studies of Captain James Cook's third voyage to the Pacific in 1779. In the third voyage, he was already a captain. In the last, which we heard yesterday, he was only a lieutenant. Nobody remembered. Right, okay. Captain James Cook arrived in Hawaii at the first time, and when the local were celebrating some sort of festival in honor of God Lono, and the way he approached the island so resembled the epiphany of God Lono that local Hawaiians were so surprised, and they took him, a white-skinned British, as incarnation of Lono and as their king. However, after a month or so, he returned to the island without knowing that the festival was already over, and this time, rather than be warm welcome, he was killed because his presence caused the great disturbance among the local. So this idea of deification of a white man by indigenous peoples actually gave rise to heated debates in anthropology. But it also inspired a lot of historians to re-examine the indigenous and European relationships. I gave a lot of examples in my thesis. I just briefly related to three here that are related to Taiwan. Here's a painting of the death of Cook. First of all, the first example related to Taiwan is David Henley. David Henley, after studying this guy, I saw him on the campus on the day I left the library with his big coat and the big suitcases. He was probably thinking how to apply his stranger king theory somewhere. Well, after studying Asia and Africa, he said, rather than acceding to European superiority based on mythology, like Sahlin said, from the Hawaiian kings, he found that indigenous peoples in the early modern period, which means 1500 to 1800 or so, actually are pushed or driven to accept these European strangers by inter-village jealousies, pursuit of power, and the need for impartial arbitration. Having these strangers among them created a certain stability in the village. Therefore, the more power these strangers had, these Europeans had, the higher esteem they enjoyed in the eyes of the local, and vice versa. Right. So unlike Sahlin stranger king, who enjoyed a deified status, Henley's stranger kings, like the Dutch in the 17th century, they were manipulators and the manipulated. Okay? So which means that the indigenous peoples were not passive in their dealings with the Europeans. Sometimes they were conscious players too. Right? And Henley actually took Taiwan, the 17th century Taiwan, as a very telling example of his type of stranger king. However, this professor, Dr. Chiu from Taiwan, she is my senior, this lady here, she said, no, I don't think so. I don't think Taiwan really had the stranger king. She said the Dutch didn't enjoy the privileges like the stranger kings usually had in this context of Southeast Asia or the Pacific, because the Formosans, they had this kind of situational logic with which they deal with the Dutch. And they didn't regard these red hair as deified beings or impartial arbitrators. In fact, she only used the term the stranger king in her book, that monograph she published in 2008, once or twice, which already indicates her position in this matter. And when I started my research on the stranger king in 2010, which was last year, I only wanted to find out who was right, the man or the woman. You don't ask these questions in other contexts because the woman is always right. Right, so who was right? That was my first intention. But by the end of my research, I was prevented to choose between these two. Why? Because the richness of the encounters themselves actually made it less important to prove who was right than to acknowledge the nuances early modern Formosans add to the discussion of indigenous agency. The written sources really show that the Dutch ruled over Formosan like rulers, governors. Their military assistance was sought for to pacify local strife and check regional power. This part fits Henley's story. However, this only happened when the local had other agenda. For example, you don't need a photo of Wang, she's here, kicking alive, right? For example, the Shiraya near the Dutch headquarters, which is in the southwest of part of Taiwan, they wanted to restrain one another. And Longyao in the south wished to end the split inside their ruling family. And the Kwangtao in the center of Taiwan, they wished to spare the region from utter destruction. Their use of a situational logic, to quote from Chiu, the lady professor, actually moved them as far as to accept the Dutch as a ruler among them. The ultimate threat to Formosans, to quote from my own conclusion, is not in fact a stranger exercising power over them, but the neighboring village, the separatists in the family, or the crazy foreign arsonists. What's how about it, faking or not, if by doing so terrible threats to life can be lifted once for all? Survival instinct had allowed the Formosans to entertain the Dutch like kings. So in other words, the stranger king was their making. As I found, Taiwan is more than a synthesis of Henley and Chiu. And Formosan, early modern Formosans exercised excellent command of foreign relations, and they were more malleable than all the ossified categories that were given by late historians, such as the poor colonized, the innocent instrumentalized, or the wicked deceptive ones, such as so. They moved within these categories. And I argue that this fluid flexibility is worthy of mentioning so that we can have a balanced picture of what these indigenous peoples in the early modern period were doing. So my stranger king case studies show how knowing indigenous European relationships in early modern Taiwan can also help one read Oceania context by comparison. In her paper on leadership in Oceania and their transformation, Dr. Guo Pei, she was here yesterday, and I don't know if she's here, she gave a very good example of how our knowledge of Pacific colonial history will improve our understanding of the fluctuations of leaders, chiefs, and big men in local societies. And with my stranger king study, I will argue that the knowledge of the colonial society in Taiwan is also very helpful. By reading 17th century Taiwan, one will know what kind of a context had happened in an earlier period. One will know how Austronesian-speaking communities back then dealt with the Dutch, and one will also know what kind of changes had happened to leadership. And with this, one can better read the Oceanian context. So in short, the history of the 17th century Formosan relations with the Dutch provides us with a new lens with which we can read other encounters between Europeans and other Austronesians across the century and across the Pacific.